まだミュートが解除になってないけど。あ、これは関係ないの？ああ、そういう、あ、わかった。じゃあもう皆さん見れてるわけね。はい。Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining the Foreign Press Center Japan's hybrid press briefing this afternoon. I am Kazuo Kodama, President of the Foreign Press Center. I will be the moderator of today's press briefing. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome today Mr. SHIKATA Noriyuki, Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs, Prime Minister's Office of Japan, as a briefer on the updates on priority policies of the Kishida administration. Now, SHIKATA-san is one of the most senior spokespersons under current administration and working most closely with the Prime Minister Kishida. Today, he will discuss what the Prime Minister is now working on right before the G7 Hiroshima summit. Mr. SHIKATA will speak for 20 minutes using a slide followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. Due to his very tight schedule, this briefing will end at 2:20 p.m. sharp. Questions will be accepted from whole media. You may post your question in the Q&A section at any time after the briefing starts. Please note that handouts for today's briefing were sent to your email addresses about an hour ago. It is available in English only. If you do not have the materials, please write in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we will send them to you. To those of you who are attending this press briefing in person from centers, our center, this room, please make sure your cell phones are in silent mode. Mr. SHIKATA, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, President Kodama. It's a great pleasure for me to come back to FPCJ. And today, I wish to discuss the themes that President Kodama explained. And let me just get started right away. On the G7 Hiroshima summit, this is something I guess most of the members of the press call are very much interested in. And if we could move on to the next slide, we'll be seeing Prime Minister Kishida hosting the summit, G7 summit in Hiroshima. In addition to the regular participants of G7 summit, there are invited countries, which is listed in this invited countries category. Australia, Brazil, and chair of African Union is Comoros, and chair of Pacific Island Forum is Cook Islands, and G20 presidency is India, and ASEAN chair this year is Indonesia, and Republic of Korea and Vietnam are participating. And there are international organizations that are invited as well. So let me just move on to the next slide in terms of the major perspectives from the Japanese presidency chair of G7 summits. Prime Minister Kishida is focusing on two major themes. One is the need to uphold the international order based on the rule of law. And G7 needs to demonstrate very strong determination to uphold the international order based on the rule of law, firmly rejecting any unilateral change of the status quo by force, or the threat to use nuclear weapons as Russia has done. In this context, there will be a discussion of how we would support Ukraine and how we would address the for example, sanctions against Russia in light of Russian aggression against Ukraine. There will be naturally discussion about the nuclear disarmament, and Prime Minister Kishida attaches much importance to this issue of promoting the goal toward the goal to achieve the world without the nuclear weapon. Secondly, outreach to the global south. I mentioned the list of invited countries, and there are participants from developing or emerging countries, and we call it the so-called global south. And we wish to make G7 a relevant forum for those developing countries or emerging economies which are not members of G7. Next, regarding various ministerial meetings, there are 15 ministerial meetings being held in Japan, across Japan, as you see in this map. And let me move on to the priority policies of the Kishida administration, and some of the kind of linkages between what Prime Minister Kishida has been promoting during the last 1.5 years as Prime Minister and G7 agenda items. Next, please. So, as many of you are aware, PM Kishida has been promoting the concept of a new form of capitalism. And he is trying to address the challenges, emerging challenges facing our capitalism under democracy, such as income disparity, the gap between the center and the local regions, or the climate change related factors. And as you see in this slide, he's trying to reach or achieve positive cycle of the growth of our economy and benefiting our people. So in terms of growth strategy, he's been focusing on promoting science and technology, R&D, innovation, and carbon neutral climate change related measures would be conducive to economic growth or economic security as well in terms of pursuing the resilient supply chain. Hopefully, this growth will lead to wage increase, and we wish to invest in people. And this is something we are promoting overseas, as we saw when Prime Minister Kishida visited Africa, trying to help African countries' investment in people, for example. Next slide is the kind of conceptual framework with different policy areas. Digital Garden City nation is something which he is trying, PM Kishida is promoting in addressing the challenges facing local regions in Japan through the use of IT technologies. And this kind of approach could be relevant for developing economies. And Japan has been exporting smart cities to Southeast Asia and other developing countries, for example. I mentioned briefly economic security issue, which will be taken up at the G7 Hiroshima summit, as well as climate change and energy transition. Japan has been working on promoting energy transition across the Asian countries under the initiative called Asia Energy Transition Initiative. We are promoting innovation, and you'll see some of those examples at the occasion of 2025 Osaka Kansai Expo. Next, please. So on diplomacy, PM Kishida has been promoting three major agenda items: protecting the universal value, which is closely related to free and open Indo-Pacific, protecting human rights. Number two is protect Japan's peace and stability, which is connected to international peace and stability. And as you are aware, PM Kishida has announced new national security strategy at the end of last year. Number three is tackling the global issues, such as nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, UN reform, free and fair economic order, tackling global health issues, as well as climate change. So this is a brief outline of PM Kishida's diplomacy, and let me just move on to his actual example of his Africa diplomacy. During the Golden Week, PM Kishida visited Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique. And in many of those meetings, the summit meetings with African leaders, there was discussion about the free and open Indo-Pacific. The Japanese view is that the Indo-Pacific has close linkages with the African continent, especially eastern side of Africa. So Egypt or Kenya or Mozambique, there are discussions on promoting concrete projects of cooperation. And let me move on to the next slide. As you are aware, he stopped by Singapore, and upon returning to Tokyo, he visited South Korea to launch this shuttle diplomacy. And obviously, we are stepping up our cooperation between Japan and ROK in light of the security threats and challenges coming from North Korea. And Japan and ROK are going to be working on Indo-Pacific cooperation projects in the future. Next, let me briefly touch upon some of possible agenda items for G7 Hiroshima Summit. There will be discussion about regional affairs, including the situation in Ukraine, regional affairs on Indo-Pacific. From the Japanese viewpoint, it's free and open Indo-Pacific, and we are encouraged to see other G7 members coming on board with this Indo-Pacific strategy. Number three is nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, followed by economic security. And on the issues of the global south, it is essential to promote cooperation with the so-called global south countries. So the following agenda items, such as climate and energy, food, global health, development, those are the kind of issues that Prime Minister Kishida is looking forward to working very closely with so-called global south countries. So that's something PM Kishida discussed with Prime Minister Modi in March when he visited Delhi, and this is going to be connected with Prime Minister Modi hosting G20 summits in India in September. Next one is the Ukraine-related issues. This is the next slide. this is a kind of a summary of Japan's measures in terms of sanctions against Russia and support for Ukraine. And as you are aware, Prime Minister Kishida visited Ukraine on March 21. The slide is the next one. So during his stay in Ukraine, he visited Bucha and Kyiv. And then Prime Minister Kishida announced additional assistance to Ukraine, totaling over $7 billion in such areas as electricity, mine clearance, agriculture, in addition to the energy sector support, as well as defense provision of defense equipment through NATO trust fund. Next slide is a brief the slide capturing Japan's concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. Next, please. And this new plan for free and open Indo-Pacific was something PM Kishida announced in his policy speech in New Delhi. And this is the kind of next step forward in terms of implementing concrete plans under free and open Indo-Pacific. And in India, he referred to, for example, promoting connectivity between India and Bangladesh in northeastern side of India. Next slide is Prime Minister Kishida's initiative in terms of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And Prime Minister announced holding the international group of eminent persons for a world without nuclear weapons. And this is more of the experts engaging in discussion on this issue. And next slide is just the summaries of what Prime Minister Kishida mentioned before, including his attendance at the NPT review conference in August last year. He was the first Japanese Prime Minister to attend NPT review conference. He attended as foreign minister before, but the Japanese Prime Minister before Mr. Kishida had never attended this NPT review conference. Next one is economic security agenda items, and there are emerging issues that is facing the global economy, and we wish to discuss among G7 members how we could address this issue of economic security. Next, please. The climate and the energy is a very important agenda item for G7 summit, and this is Japan's initiatives on green transformation, including the issuing of green transformation economic transition bond, as well as introducing the emission trading in Japan. Next, please. So Japan is committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. At the same time, Japan is very eager to promote Asia's energy transition. So we are engaging with other Asian countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, to support their energy transition as related to climate change. Next, please. Gender-related issues will be part of the G7 summit's agenda items. And I am just including some of the references at the ministerial meetings being held so far. Next, please. Digitalization issue as related to AI or ChatGPT related issues are getting lots of attention. And as we saw in the discussion among G7 digital and tech minister in late April, there is emerging intensive debate about how we cope with emerging technologies, especially as related to AI, how we could promote responsible AI and AI governance. Of course, Japan has been under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, promoting this concept of data-free flow with trust. And naturally, this discussion has much to do with creating international rules governing this area. And Prime Minister Kishida is advocating to engage in this discussion in the context of G7. So I stopped at this point of time and welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Shikata-san. Now, floor is open to questions from foreign media. I will invite questions first from those of you who are here with us in this press briefing room. And please come up to the microphone when your name is called and mention your name and affiliation before asking your question. Now, also to those of you who are joining this press briefing online, please press the raise your hand button on the screen or write it in the Q&A session. I have received two questions from the online listeners. Now, when your name is called by me, please make sure that the microphone is unmuted and mention your name and affiliation before asking your question. So, first from the floor, please, yes.
Thank you. Tribune News from Indonesia. Actually, I would like to ask two questions. One is do you have a fixed confirmation from all the invited countries? 100% they will come to the Hiroshima, including our president from Indonesia will come to Hiroshima. That's my first question. The second question is about the NATO. There is an initial proposal of NATO headquarters in Asia will be in Japan. So is this also will be discussed in this summit, G7 summit in Hiroshima? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Regarding the participants in G7 Hiroshima summit, our view is that all the leaders whom we have invited are committed to coming, and including President Joko. And of course, President Joko was hosting a G20 summit last year in Bali. And of course, this year, Indonesia is a presidency of ASEAN. So we wish to continue to closely collaborate with Indonesia, not only bilaterally, but also in the context of Japan, ASEAN related issues. Of course, we respect ASEAN's centrality, but as I mentioned, there are a number of issues that we need to work together, including Asian energy transition. And Japan has been supporting some of environmental problems, challenges facing, for example, Jakarta, as you are aware. Thank you. And on the second issue of NATO, I'm aware of this report about the Tokyo office of NATO, but I haven't heard, that this plan is confirmed at this point of time. We have been very closely working with NATO, including its Secretary General, and anyway, we are looking forward to deepening our ties between Japan and NATO. And as you saw in terms of Prime Minister Kishida's attendance at NATO summit last year, and holding NATO plus AP4, Asia Pacific 4, which include Japan, ROK, Australia, and New Zealand. This is, from our viewpoint, very important platform for us to deepen our collaboration between Japan and NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikata-san. Now, I have a previously submitted a question from the media, which is this, the Mr. Bagshaw of Australian Sydney Morning Herald. His question is this, Shikata-san. Japan has come under criticism from US, France, and Australia for sole custody laws issue. Will Prime Minister Kishida address this in the maybe G7 summit?
As I mentioned, there is reference to, there's expected discussion on gender issues. Of course, this is more in the context of how we could protect, human rights of women and girls globally, and how we could cooperate among G7 member countries. So I don't think this specific issue that you raised is going to be discussed. But as you are aware, inside Japan, there has been some discussion about the review of the current civil law, which only accepts sole custody, and so there is discussion whether it is appropriate to introduce the concept of joint custody. And this is something in terms of the Japanese, the legal reform. This, I believe, is the issue that has been discussed at the Family Law Subcommittee of the Legislative Council, which is a legislative council under the Ministry of Justice. And that meeting was held last month. So there has been some discussion regarding possible legal reform, but I don't think there has been any conclusions to have been reached at this point of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikata-san. Now, one more question actually is from AP, Ms. Mari Yamaguchi. I read it out. Thank you for the briefing. I have a question about Prime Minister Kishida's effort in nuclear disarmament. Japan is under US nuclear umbrella, and its two key security partners, US and South Korea, recently announced in the Washington Declaration to strengthen extended deterrence, including nuclear information sharing. Now, will Japan be part of it too? And how Prime Minister Kishida, whose lifetime goal is to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, will convince other G7 partners, many of them are nuclear weapon states? And what concrete and realistic proposal will he make at the G7?
As I mentioned, Prime Minister Kishida is committed to pursuing this notion of the world without nuclear weapons. And we recognize, that the current international landscape is very challenging, including, as we see the Russia's, threat of the use of nuclear weapons, which we would not accept. So we are attentive, to these challenging international environments, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we would give up and especially Prime Minister Kishida is committed to pursuing this goal. And by hosting G7 Hiroshima Summit with the participation of the leaders of the United States, UK, and France, which possess nuclear weapons, this is going to be a very symbolic occasion to send out messages, that we should continue non-use of nuclear weapons, which has been the case during the last 77 years. And we need to be aware of the tragic reality of possible sufferings of nuclear weapons as you visit Hiroshima, or as the leaders visit Hiroshima. So hopefully, with the G7 Hiroshima summits being hosted in Hiroshima, we would regain the new momentum for this discussion of the goal of the reaching goal of the world without nuclear weapons. On the issue of US-Korea collaboration, we are attentive to this emerging discussion between the US and ROK, and we welcome this closer partnership between the United States and the ROK on the issues of extended deterrence. And of course, Japan is also under the extended deterrence provided from the United States, and under the current very severe international security landscape, especially in Asia, Japan is facing the countries, that surrounded by the countries which possess nuclear weapons, and realistically, we need to ensure this Japan-US alliance is effective in preventing the possible the wars, including the use of nuclear weapons. So, regarding this point about the possibility of Japan engaging with this US ROK arrangements, as I mentioned, we welcome US ROK cooperation, and we have been discussing the collaboration among the trilateral countries, Japan, US, and ROK, as related to, for example, North Korean threats. So at this juncture, I would just mention, that we would continue to deepen our collaboration among those three countries, meaning the Japan, US, and ROK in security arena. Thank you.
Thank you. Question from the floor. Yes, please.
Thanks very much. It's Michael Smith from the Australian Financial Review. Just two quick questions. Why is it important, or what's the significance of having these non-member countries present? And can you comment particularly on Australia and India in the context that they'll also be attending the Quad Summit in Sydney shortly after? And are you concerned Joe Biden's not going to make it? If this happens, will it detract from the effectiveness of the summit? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As I mentioned, Prime Minister Kishida is coming up with a view that it is extremely important to engage with the so-called the global South countries and come up with G7's contribution to, for example, energy security or food security challenges. And these are the kind of issues that PM Kishida was discussing in Africa or in India. We see that the food and energy security challenges are affecting many of African countries with the rising prices of food or energy. And some of those countries are suffering from those emerging economic challenges. Of course, it's combined with the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic and some of accumulated, debts of those developing countries. And so we would also be discussing the issue of development finance, how we could make it fair and more transparent for realizing sustainable development. So, so our view is that it is extremely important to engage with those developing countries and emerging economies to prevent the further divisions of the international community. And the G7 Hiroshima Summit would be the occasion for us to forge closer partnership with G7 members and the invited countries, which represent, some of the regional framework. And on the issues of Australian and India participation, of course, India is going to be hosting a G20 summit, as I mentioned, in September. And Australia is hosting Quad Summit, as you mentioned. And we think that with deepening collaboration between Japan and Australia, it has also, bilateral meanings. And Quad Summit will be one of the most suitable occasions to discuss deepening of our cooperation under the Indo-Pacific area. So this is something we are very much looking forward to. On the issue of President Biden, we have noticed the reports, and so far, we have not heard from the U.S. government regarding this, the possible impact on the scheduled trip of President Biden to Japan and Hiroshima. We understand that the U.S. government announced on April 25 that President Biden is going to attend G7 Hiroshima Summit. So that's, I guess I answered all the questions.
Nashida-san, of course, has to leave here at 2:20 sharp. I have 3 questions from the online listeners, but before that, I noticed that recognize, yes, the gentleman from this room, yes, to ask a question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, William Sposato, contributor to Foreign Policy magazine. One very brief question. You mentioned everyone who had been invited is coming. Does that include President Zelensky, who you had mentioned in your briefing? Secondly, your presentation, thank you very much for that, sort of studiously avoids the references to either China or Taiwan. Hopefully the leaders will be a little less reticent in discussing these, what would seem to be a very important issue. What can you tell us more directly about the concerns about the situation over the Taiwan Straits today?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. When Prime Minister Kishida visited Kyiv, in his meeting with President Zelensky, page 17, there was a confirmation that President Zelensky would be participating in G7 Hiroshima Summit online. So we are expecting President Zelensky participating in, I guess, one of the sessions during the summit. And as I mentioned, there will be intensive debates on the issues of the Russian aggression against the Ukraine and how we could support Ukraine in terms of humanitarian assistance. From Japanese viewpoint, we would be also interested in supporting reconstruction of Ukraine in the future. So anyhow, President Zelensky is expected to join the discussion among the G7 leaders. The second point about China, Japan, along with other G7 nations, have discussed about China's recent developments in the international environment. And we recognize the importance of engaging candidly with and expressing our concerns directly to China. And there has been reference to this issue at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, including in the joint document. And Japan's view toward China is we have been attentive to China's recent external posture or military developments, which has caused serious concerns to Japan as well as the international community. And so this is one thing, but at the same time, in November last year, when Prime Minister Kishida met with President Xi Jinping, which showed some momentum for dialogue. And Japan's view is that we need to be meeting with Chinese leaders to raise some of the issues of concerns, but also there are areas for collaboration on global challenges, such as climate change, biodiversity, or global health security, and gender equality, for example. So I expect, this China-related issues would be discussed. And on the specific issue of Taiwan, you probably noticed that at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, the joint documents has reference to Taiwan Strait issue in the following sentences. We affirm the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element in security and prosperity in the international community, and call for the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues, and so forth. So there is no change in the basic positions of the G7 members on Taiwan, and so forth. So in the meeting, the foreign ministers meeting, there has already been reference to China and Taiwan. Thank you.
Now, we have just 6-7 minutes to go, but for the sake of everybody, including Shikata-san, I hope you don't mind if I present you the following 3 questions in an abridged format, but still one by one. The first question is from Mr. Agafonov Kirill of TASS News Agency. His question simply concerns possibility of additional sanctions against Moscow, Russia. The question is this, could you confirm that there were reports that G7 nations are considering near total ban on exports to Russia? Confirm it or explain Japan's position. This is his question. The second question is from the Brazilian Nakaba Shinik, Valor Economio newspaper. His question is this: Brazilian government seems to be much close to China and Russia. What should be done to close the distance to the G7 stance regarding the war in Ukraine? This is his question. The final question is rather general question from Nishimura Karin of Radio France. In a nutshell, she put this way: the G7 summit final communique is always a kind of catalog of wishes. Now, is it not too much? How can you avoid to give the impression that it is only words without concrete commitments or very long-term commitments? Sorry to ask 3 questions. So whatever, please, Shikata-san.
Regarding the first question regarding the G7's additional sanctions against Russia, as you are aware, G7 members have been stepping up sanctions against Russia in light of continued Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And Prime Minister Kishida has been mentioning, that, for example, today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's Asia, and the European security landscape is inseparable from that in Asia. And so Prime Minister Kishida, as a chair of G7 Hiroshima Summit, is going to be discussing how we would make our sanctions against Russia effective. And there are issues such as leakages or circumventions of sanctions. So we need to make sure, that the existing sanctions are effective and to induce Russia to change behavior. And on the second question about Brazil, of course, Brazil is the major country being represented, from Latin American countries, and we wish to engage with the discussions with Brazil on the kind of perspectives that they have, President Lula, and this is a very important occasion, to seek for areas for our cooperation between G7 and Brazil, which is, from our viewpoint, one of the major kind of player in the so-called global South countries. So this will be, very important occasions for us to seek concrete areas for cooperation, including energy, food, global health issues. Those global challenges are facing all of us. And let me just mention, that the reason why, we are, or Prime Minister Kishida is very strongly opposing against the Russian aggression against Ukraine is that if you allow the status quo, the unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force, those small countries could suffer as a result. So it is essential, that we abide by international law and international rules, and this kind of ways of thinking could be accepted by smaller or vulnerable countries, as well. And the last question about Nishimura-san, on at least, we are of the view that G7 countries with so much kind of commonalities and shared values could be contributing to those global challenges the international community is facing. And when we look at the kind of dysfunctioning of UN Security Council, from the Japanese viewpoint, the G7 is a very important occasion to promote our cooperation, to establish a unity among G7 members. But this is unity among G7 members may not be enough. And that's why we are trying to engage more proactively with the so-called global South countries. So, so hopefully, we would be sending out, more constructive message to the international community, including the nuclear disarmament issues that I mentioned from Hiroshima G7 summit. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to conclude today's hybrid press briefing. First of all, Shikata-san, thank you very much again for taking time out of your very busy schedule to share with us on what the top priority issues in light of G7 Hiroshima summit, which will take place from 19th to 21st of this month. I would like to also thank all of you foreign media journalists, Tokyo-based diplomats, as well as other audience who have participated in today's briefing. Thank you all and have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much.